thank you all very much for giving your views and your insights into the project. My name is Jason Leggett. I'm Head of Business Development for Peel Media, and I've been working with the University of Salford in organising today. It falls on me to chair this Q&A session, and I'm sure many of you in the audience will have questions for our panel. Please, if you do have a question, could you raise your hand? If you need a microphone, there is one available, and Sasha at the back there has the microphone. If you don't, please just speak up so everyone can hear your question. If you'd like to introduce yourself and the organisation you work for or you represent, and then ask your question, and then hopefully the panel members will be able to respond. Thank you very much. So can I take the first question, please? Yes, sir, right at the front here.
Hi, thank you. My name is Edward Morgan. I work at the BBC Academy, a colleague of Richard's. Well, it's an extraordinary vision and a very, very exciting one, but could the panel say more about how it can connect with the entire north? Is it 13 million or 15 million people, a very, very diverse area from Lincoln to the borders? Because it's clear that it's going to be brilliant for Salford and brilliant for Manchester, but a lot of work and thought will have to go into the wider ambition, and I'm just more intrigued by that wider, bigger northern vision.
Thank you, Edward. Martin, can you explain how that might work with the university?
Universities are strange organisations, and what makes them unusual, and there are about 10,000 of them in the world, is that they're composed of people whose primary loyalty is not to the institution. Their primary loyalty tends to be to the field of study or the discipline. My own discipline is archaeology. Archaeologists are happiest when they're at conferences of other archaeologists talking about how stupid their vice-chancellors are for not giving archaeology more money. And that's what us academics do all the time. So universities bring natural networks in that sense, because when you concentrate on a field of study, you'll find in all of our universities that our academic staff in particular are always forming alliances with others in other institutions with whom they get on or have common ideas, encounter at a conference, work together and have those objectives. And if you look at the way that a lot of research council funding goes, research council funding increasingly recognises that, because funds are actually given jointly to people. So in fact, FIRM, which is a good example of exactly how that network working, is in fact designed and implemented precisely along those lines. It brings together universities because the people in FIRM want to work together. So universities is a natural partner in drawing in others, because that's actually what universities do best. Thank you.
Richard, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a point I think the BBC is acutely sensitive to, is that, as I mentioned, our primary objective here is to improve the perception of the BBC by the 15 million people across the whole of the north of England. And obviously, if you live in Newcastle, for instance, or Carlisle, this feels very distant. So what are we doing about that? We're doing a number of things. One is we are determined to get more network production across the north of England, Yorkshire, North East, for instance. I was in Newcastle last week for the launch of Tracy Beaker, the very successful CBBC children's drama, which was made in the North East in Newcastle. We need to do a lot more like that. Secondly, of course, one of the most important ways in which I think, or I hope, we will change the perception of the BBC is by creating network content, big programmes on BBC One, BBC Two, that bluntly are much more attractive to audiences in the north of England. And we're doing a lot of research at the moment to understand the very subtle tonal elements of humour, elements of approach, sometimes but not always issues of portrayal, that work better for audiences across the north of England. And one of the things that Peter Salmon, who runs BBC North, and I are going to be doing is working with the network controllers, the people who run BBC One, 2, Radio 1, etc., to try and encourage, persuade, cajole them to commission more content that works for audiences across the north of England. And then the other thing we're doing is we're just trying to join up the BBC's activities across the north of England. We have a little network now which is better coordinated, drawing together all of the BBC's activities across the north of England, just to make sure that we're connecting with people. We're doing more outreach. We had Radio 5 Live, for instance, in Hull, for 5 days last month, which was very successful. We've done some children's events. Which way is Liverpool? That way? In Liverpool, etc. So we're very sensitive to this issue, and I hope we can make good progress on it. It can't just be Salford or the North West.
And Paul, can I just make a comment just from Peel's perspective? Is it just about bringing people to Media City, or is there other ways in which we hope to work with partners across the north?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would echo what both Richard and Martin have said. I mean, I think the reality is that the scale of opportunity is what's different here. And if you go back, again, 25 years to the early 1980s, when the BBC and other media organisations had a much larger presence in the region simply because that was the way it was done then. I think what's happened in that intervening period, and not least in the last 3 to 5 years, is that because of the shrinkage in commitments to regional cities, there's been an exponential increase in expectation on the BBC sometimes to cover off some of the issues that previously have been dealt with by the commercial sector, particularly around content provision. So now there is, in many respects, quite an unfair burden placed on the BBC to deliver for all parties across all parts of the country. From our perspective, assisting the BBC and others who are on the site, it's actually about spreading the gospel as far as we can. And actually, it's not a north-south debate as far as I'm concerned. It's actually about offering a scale of a development and an opportunity, happens to be in the north of England, that frankly everybody wants to tap into. You know, Ascent Media are based in Santa Monica. They're not the slightest bit interested, frankly, whether it's Salford Quays or Timbuktu. The point is they see the opportunity to develop and create content and distribute it internationally to 140 countries because they know that commissioning power, which Richard has talked about, lies in Salford Quays. And there is therefore a necessary and inevitable migration of the pipeline of companies who work with some of the bigger brands that will be based here.
Thank you very much. Is there another question? The lady at the back, it's Mercedes, I think.
Hi, it's Mercedes Clark-Smith. I'm the Project Director for Northern Net Innovation and Collaboration Project. This is a question really for Paul, building on what you've just talked about. What kind of connectivity can businesses expect?
Well, you may have seen in a happy coincidence, we made an announcement of a partnership with BT yesterday, and the collaboration with BT is really important because one of the things I should have mentioned earlier on, I always forget something, I get slightly carried away, is that connectivity across the piece is important. It doesn't really matter whether I'm a resident in an apartment or I'm running a small business or I'm popping here as a freelance or I'm Richard at my computer in the office. The quality of connectivity and the ability to get material out of the development is crucial. So what we've done as a company, of course, is deliver the necessary holes in the ground, if you like, to be populated by the 20 million metres of fibre that are going to be installed in the next 18 months. It's the equivalent of a major city in terms of the amount of fibre through which you can do lots of stuff. The important thing here also from an esoteric point of view is that with the 2 apartment blocks, it was important to have everything piped through by fibre because this is not a development where we're going to have satellite dishes everywhere. Nothing wrong with satellite dishes, it's preferable if you can do it by another means. And the BT deal, again, allows us to have very broad bandwidth. Inevitably, it also means that you can cherry-pick the services you require. So depending on what business you're running, or whether you're a resident or an individual or a major corporate, you may pick and choose those services to suit the business, Mercedes. Also, Manchester itself, as people in the room will know, have established a growing and increasingly wide network, and we can tap into that together, as we can indeed across the north.
Thank you. Martin, you lead on the UKERN Janet network in this region, do you know?
That's right. I mean, universities all have access to Janet and Super Janet, so we have our own network in that sense. And one of the things that we're working on is to see exactly how those 2 networks can join up, so we get seamlessness with the university side and the BT contract. We'll achieve that.
Thank you. And Richard, the BBC itself has its own network, obviously for its broadcast network, but will you be utilising the infrastructure on site as well?
Very much so.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Any questions? John at the back, please, in the background.
Hello, John Holland. I'm the Media City Director for the University of Salford. It's a question really for Paul, but for all the panel too. The business model of television's changed, and the BBC's presence here evidences that. There's a tendency to outsource to a degree that was never the case in the past, and we've seen a proliferation of much smaller companies all over the place. What are you doing, Paul, to encourage smaller companies to participate in this very high-end development?
Well, actually, it's not something that's going to happen. It's something that is happening. I mean, there's a building over there called the Pie Factory, which you can't see because it's directly behind you, but the one with the Media City UK Studios label on, which you'll see from the terrace. The Pie Factory was a pie factory, funnily enough, until 3 years ago, and they went bust at the point when Tesco were offering them 3p a pie and decided it was no longer commercially viable. Happily, Peel owned the freehold, and the company decided at that stage to convert it into a number of sound stages and studios for photographic use. So we now actually have a thriving business in the Pie Factory. There are a number of programs that have been recently made in there. The Jimmy McGovern production called The Street that was on BBC One. The Christmas special for the royal family is being shot at the moment. And a thriller called Paradox, which you may have seen recently, all shot in the Pie Factory. To answer your question, what's happened as a result of those, A, the commissioning of those programs, and B, the necessity to be around them, is the requirement for space provision required by small companies. So there are 20 small companies who are based in the Pie Factory, offering effectively a sort of mini Media City style proposition. So, for example, we're about to announce next week that TSL, who are a big integrated systems supplier who'll be working with us on the main development, they're taking space in the Pie Factory. They'll be the latest tenant. The Pie Factory will then be full in terms of tenancies. I think what it exemplifies, John, to get back to your point, is that if you have commissioning decisions being made in a place and the programs are then being produced and the content is being produced, whether it's for television or anything else, the fact is there's a huge number of businesses that feed those programs, and Richard will pick on this point, that compete for the right to be chosen to work on those services. It doesn't mean there's an absolute right. What it means is that the opportunity is created in an environment where it's never been before. And I think, certainly from the BBC's point of view, in terms of their determination to spread the love in terms of commissioning, it's something that Richard could talk about, particularly from a children's perspective.
That's my cue.
That's your cue.
I think it's really exciting what's happening. You are seeing a historic, to use jargon, lowering of the barriers of entry for creative individuals to create great content, including but not limited to television. And I think that's going to continue and accelerate, particularly with the development of things like IPTV, and the BBC's IPTV technical team will be based here. So it's an incredibly creative and dynamic period for the content sector. And to me, one of the most important things for this site is that we attract, working with Peel, the BBC does everything it can to attract a wide variety of creative and technical organisations and individuals to this site. And therefore we've been very pleased that Peel have offered a complete range of accommodation facilities. So literally, if you want 2 desks for a fortnight at very low cost, that's going to exist. If you want 1,000 desks for 10 years, that's going to exist, which I think is fantastic. And one of the challenges for the BBC is how can we work with Peel and these creative organisations to attract them to this site? What could we do to open up, giving them access to talent or to training or to pooling other resources? What can we do to make this a vibrant multipolar organisation? Because their success will be our success for 2 reasons. One is we will develop the talent pool, and secondly, we buy content from these individuals. And that really matters to us. Access to innovation and creativity is obviously the lifeblood of the BBC. And so it's really important to us that this is a dynamic, entrepreneurial community of content creators. And I'm using that term very broadly. I mean, when you think of all the great innovations, I think I'm right in saying this, nearly all of the great innovations on the web in the last decade have come from software engineers, not traditional content creators in the way that the BBC would have traditionally defined them. And that's why anything we can do that blurs the distinction between design, software engineering, and traditional editorial content skills, there's tremendous creativity in that triangle.
Martin, there's a project called the Media Enterprise Centre, isn't there, not at the university that you're involved with? And how will that help in this instance?
Yes, I mean, the Media Enterprise Centre, which I think is that away?
Yeah, it's the South Tower, I think.
That's right. The Media Enterprise Centre, where in fact the firm, a project will be located, is an opportunity for small to medium-sized enterprises to be involved on site. In getting a location, and I think that that unfolds and the way not only the occupancy but also the way that the Media Enterprise Centre holds together as a whole. I mean, the lease, I think, the lease is held formally by Salford City Council, but it's an opportunity to develop that sort of activity will be important and significant.
Excellent.
I think there are other spin-offs beyond that. I mean, all of us in the higher education sector are under acute pressure in various ways to demonstrate the impact of what we do in economic terms, and we're seeing that. We're seeing that in terms of the Research Excellence Framework and the new approach to measuring impact, but we all know that we're going to see it more and more with the crisis of public finances in the higher education sector. And quite a lot of us, my university, and I think quite a few of the universities who are here today, would recognise opportunities for them in working with small and medium enterprises in their particular areas to generate those spin-offs. And I think beyond the immediate opportunities for small and medium enterprise development on-site, there are huge opportunities for spin-off opportunities off-site, simply because ways of working will enable those industries to connect to the content value that will come from the magnet effect of the BBC and other large commissioning bodies coming here. And I think in many of our cities in the north we've seen that. I mean, an area not far from here in Salford has over 150 small creative industries that have started up in the last 2 or 3 years. And they're largely, of course, moving into 19th century mill buildings, converted sites, taking opportunity of them. I think many northern cities have that. And again, I think that there's a spin-off activity beyond the site which generates real economic value.
Thank you. There is a workshop 2 this afternoon after lunch, which is actually going to be looking at innovation and collaboration between SMEs. So if I can remind you all just to register over lunch with an appropriate workshop so you can take part in. If I go to the next question, Stuart, I think on the back row there.
Hello, gentlemen. Stuart McFarlane from Yorkshire Forward. That's the Regional Development Agency in Yorkshire. Very pleased to hear the BBC's view, and it always has been, about working across the north. But obviously I'm concerned about the creative and digital industries in the Yorkshire and Humber region. And obviously, Richard, I know you know Screen Yorkshire and working with them. So how can the businesses, the content providers in Yorkshire, take advantage of this wonderful opportunity that is here behind me? Do we, the message that Yorkshire Forward and Screen Yorkshire give, do we say, move to the northwest? Because that's not one that comes very easily to my lips, as you would imagine. So how can we actually take advantage of all the wonderful things that are going on here?
I think others should comment on that as well. I think the answer to the question is no, do not move to the northwest. That would be, from my personal point of view, crazy. We want to see production in Yorkshire by indigenous Yorkshire firms. We want to see production in Yorkshire by firms from outside Yorkshire. As the point I made earlier, that we need to ensure there is more network production across the eastern side of the country, Yorkshire and the northeast. How you take advantage of this, I mean, there are various things underway, as you know, the improved connectivity across the north of England. I mean, I hope that we can improve the talent pool here, and there'll be some movement of that talent pool across the Pennines in both directions, I hope. And as you know, that certain genres such as drama historically have been a very mobile workforce. So if we can strengthen the talent pool here, I'm sure that will benefit other parts of the country. This is part of the answer as well, is that I hope we can improve access to the network commissioners in London. When I say we, I mean Peter and I and others working on this can improve access to northern indies, wherever they are based, to the network commissioners in London. We want to get those folk and their commissioning executives and so on out and about in the north of England more generally. So, for instance, next week, Richard Klein, who runs BBC Three, it's not Yorkshire, I'm afraid, it's just a bit north. He's in Newcastle for a day, meeting indies up there. But invite him to Yorkshire, and I will do everything I can to make sure he comes up, and Janice Hadlow, who runs BBC Two, etc. So we're determined to try and make the folk in London, who are not part of BBC North, not part of this endeavour, better connected, more accessible to creative organisations across the north of England.
Excellent, thank you very much. Jane, you have a question? The microphone's just coming down the middle here for you.
Thanks a lot. Jane Dean, Programme Director for Media City for the Public Sector Partners. It's a question primarily for Richard, but perhaps the whole panel would comment on it. And I'm plagiarising. I'm going to ask a question that was asked of me last week by a very bright second-year student at your university, Martin, doing journalism. And she said, you know, I'm fired up with enthusiasm for my trade, for journalism. I see the BBC who are going to be here right down the road from where I've been studying. How can I get a job with you at the BBC? And today's all about opportunities for higher education, and clearly that's one very practical area that I think will be sort of uppermost in a lot of people's minds. How can you capture that enthusiasm that people have for coming to work with you, and how are you going to target graduates from across the north and across the country? She also said, and how do I know that what I'm studying now is going to be relevant when I graduate in a couple of years' time? So that might be something you all want to comment on.
Maybe I could start on that. I mean, one thing that we know from quite systematic studies that have been done across the whole sector of higher education in the UK is that students who have work experience in the course of their undergraduate studies stand a significantly greater chance of employment after graduation. And that's now been well documented. So all of us, I think, are concentrating in various ways on work experience opportunities, particularly as of course, there is general and I think appropriate public pressure on value for money in higher education, particularly as we face the prospect of significant rises in university fees. So one thing that I think that this offers as an opportunity for all universities who are here, and not just my university, is the opportunity of working with partner organisations who are here, and not just the BBC, but as it in fact expands, to create significant internship opportunities for our students. And I think, again, you know, that's the sort of thing that I'm very interested in talking to other Vice-Chancellors about, widening those opportunities for internship. So that partly addresses the question, I think, of employability generally. I think the question of whether degree study is relevant is an almost eternal question, because, and I think the answer is, in an industry like this, the answer is almost certainly not. Because the industry is moving so quickly that it's almost impossible to design a curriculum that in a narrow sense would keep up with it. I think what our task is, and this is rather a sort of an old style answer, but I think it still holds good, is actually to produce graduates who can think for themselves, who can take initiatives, who can seize opportunities, who can work with other people, so that when they move into an environment that's moving very, very quickly, they're able to do that. And it's always interesting when this sort of question comes up for all of us in the room to ask ourselves the question whether we're now doing the job we thought we would do when we were at university. And the answer is almost certainly not only we're not doing the job, but many of us are now in jobs that we didn't even know existed when we were at university. So it's creating that flexibility of graduateness that I think is our task there.
Well, I studied genetics at university, so I don't know what went wrong with me. I should have anyway. So I think there are many answers to your question. The first is we are going to be recruiting at least 500 people on this site. And in early January, we're going to launch the BBC recruitment website for BBC North. It'll develop beyond that, but it will be, I think I've seen the designs, it's a very fresh, rather different for a BBC Jobs website. There's a lot of information on it about what sort of people we're looking for. You can register interest, tells you a lot about the departments moving here. There's some excellent short films with lots of people who do all sorts of different jobs, technical, editorial, the support functions talking about their work and what they like about it and what they don't like about it. So it's a good site. That's launching in January. So that's one answer to your question. I think more generally, I think this is an area of tremendous potential for the BBC. We also want the brightest and the best. I absolutely echo your point about work experience. It's vital. How do we open that up? Partly to support all of you, but also to make sure we get the brightest and the best. It's a great way of test driving people. I'll make a couple of other points. One is that you'll see this on the website, hopefully. We are putting an uncharacteristic emphasis, uncharacteristic for the BBC that is, on attitudes and behaviours on our recruitment. They are as important as skills and experience. We want people who are open-minded, restless, curious about the future, people who want to work across multiple genres or multiple platforms, people who are collaborative, fundamentally audience-facing, curious about the audience. These are all the sort of attributes we're looking for. The other thing I'd mention is that I know some of this is already underway, but I hope we can do lots more, is working with your organisations and other organisations in this sector through, I think there's 101 different things we can do, but basically to help to ensure that the skills, the experience and the connections that your people are forming are relevant to them and to us. The supply and the demand, match through mentoring or through shaping curricula, through masterclasses, through work experience, seminars, visits. There's 101 things we can and I hope will do. And I know some of those conversations are already underway, and obviously there'll be more of those around the Connect and Create conference in Teesside. But I mean, the point's been made several times this morning, and I know it's a cliche, but it's true. The buildings are magnificent, but it isn't about buildings. It's about people and creative endeavour and entrepreneurial spirit. That's what will make this place fly. That's what's so valuable to the BBC. We can have the finest buildings in the world. If they're full of darts, it's a disaster. We need the most talented, restless, ambitious people here. And I think this is an extraordinary opportunity for the BBC basically to rejuvenate itself. We're moving up people from London, we're moving people over from Manchester. About a third of the people on this site by December 2011, I think, will be completely new to the BBC, or I hope they will be. And that's a rare thing for an institution with 90 years of history, and we have to make the most of that opportunity.
That's great.
Yeah,
Paul, could you just talk about a little bit about the other opportunities, the other companies that might be here?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to make a point on journalism in general. I mean, I think if you take journalism at university today, then you shouldn't make assumptions about being employed. I come from a different era, obviously, and I went to a splendid establishment called Preston Polytechnic, which is now called something rather more grandiose, and I went back there a few weeks ago. And as a 19-year-old, I worked in a newsroom, but I never made assumptions that I would get a job, because in journalism, the competition's always been enormous. The competition is greater now simply because of the decline of certain sectors within that so-called traditional media. And therefore what you have is actually a great virtue if you're an employer, but a disaster if you're somebody with a qualification, because unless you have stand out in the marketplace, you won't get that job. So the message to students, and I've been asked to do it and articulate it at various conferences, is quite simple actually. Yes, it can be about qualifications, but more than that, it's about what you bring to the table that differentiates you from the next candidate or the next 50 or 100 candidates. And this is not just the BBC's responsibility to employ journalists, there are lots of other organisations as well. So I think the mindset has to be different if people really want to get jobs. And there is also a risk, I think, of a disconnect between the training that people are receiving and the reality of the economic marketplace. And that's not something that can change overnight. And HE and Martin's right to talk about it, because sometimes expectations are not managed well and people make assumptions about a world out there that doesn't really exist. So I'm sorry, that's not exactly a positive message, but I think what I'm saying is that you can get those jobs, but the job will not come and find you.
Thank you, Paul. Lynn.
Hi, Lynn McCadden from Northwest Vision and Media. This is a question really for Martin. We've heard a lot of very exciting and very positive thinking around partnerships and collaboration from universities. I'd just like your thoughts on what you think the barriers to that actually happening might be.
Yes, it's a very good question and a very important one. I think one of the challenges for the higher education sector everywhere is the need almost to set up interpreters, enablers, facilitators, sort of almost border agents between higher education and both the public sectors and the private sectors. And it goes back to the point that I made in response to an earlier question about the particular nature of universities. What drives academics in universities is seeking reputational capital. And seeking reputational capital traditionally through publishing in peer-reviewed, accredited international journals. That's the vital dynamo that actually drives us on and makes us successful, and that's rightly recognised both in this country and internationally, as a core aspect of the output of universities, and it's recognised through our ranking systems. And in the region we have great universities. Most closest to us here, the University of Manchester, which ranks very, very well in the world in terms of those sorts of recognitions. And that really, I think, that produces a huge amount of intellectual capital. The problem is that quite often that is out of sync with the needs of particularly business and industry, and it's out of sync in two ways. It tends to be out of sync in terms of the time frame, because the normal time frame, and myself included, as an academic who still researches and publishes, is that we would tend to expect our work to receive fruition after the grant's been given in a time span of between 2 and 5 years, because that's the normal time that it tends to take to get to the point where you've gone through refereeing process and publication. So that's a time sync that very clearly doesn't work for a hungry industry that's really trying to be competitive. So we have a timescale problem. And then we have almost an output language type problem, and that is because the way that we necessarily work is a language which is almost self-referential to our own fields and professions. We're writing for, in fact, a vast international network of specialists in media or archaeology or history or chemistry or physics. We're not writing for that immediate market. And so you've got a translation issue, which is how you interpret and translate that into the needs of business and industry. I think the experience of numerous failed science parks around the world shows us that just can't be taken for granted. You can't just create an environment, put people together and expect somehow that it works, because it doesn't. And in fact, far more science parks have failed than have succeeded across higher education as a whole because of a lack of recognition for that. So I think the challenge for us in the Media City project is how to put those interpreters, facilitators, translators in place to enable the knowledge transfer between the university sector and the private sector. I think it's tremendously important. I think there are no easy answers to that. I mean, I think all of us who are involved in the Media City project will recognise a commitment to getting that right. I think we've got to work with partner organisations such as your own to figure out how to do it.
Thank you, Martin. A couple more questions. Lady just at the back there, and then straight after Keith. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Judith Stamper from the University of Leeds. I just wondered a little while ago whether there's an elephant in the room, and maybe that is Alistair Darling's statement today, the fact that we're going to have 10% cuts across all public services. We're in the middle of, they say, one of the worst recessions since the 1930s. And this place behind me here was built, or was thought of in much more optimistic times. How are you dealing with the present financial situation? Selling this to people coming in, problems with ITV, yes, and Channel 4, I'm sure, and an uncertain future.
I suppose from a development point of view, and Richard and Martin will have a view on their own organisations, we were fortunate that decisions were taken when they were taken, clearly. We started building in the mid-2007. Several months later, something rather dramatic appears to have happened and the world's gone pear-shaped. But fortunately, we have a bank loan in place that remains in place. So everything will be built. From our perspective, there's absolute certainty around that. This is not a debate. There may have been debates several years ago, but this is not a debate. Yes, there will be an impact on public finances. We're not a public sector organisation, we're a private company. So we're developing this, we're actually spending £500 million. So there's clearly a commercial imperative as well to make it work, both from a collaborative point of view with the partners in this room, but also with commercial organisations as well. Now, if we'd have been completing in 2009, I think your question would have been absolutely on the nail, because clearly the climate is possibly at its worst at the moment. In 2011, certainly from the conversations we're having with companies, we detect that their forward planning strategy is built around, yes, a reshaped business, but that reshaping is actually taking place now. And therefore, in 2 years' time, they'll have a different perspective on how they run the business, how many people they'll employ, the kind of content they'll want to produce, or how they'll integrate with the university, or indeed partner with the BBC. Perfectly valid question, Judith. I don't actually know the answer ultimately yet, but if you come back in a couple of years and will give you an idea.
Thank you, Judith.
From the university's point of view, yeah.
Gentlemen, would you like to add to that?
I think it's not only an elephant, it's a question of how big it is. And certainly in our case, and I'm sure in the case of your university, we had built an anticipated cut of at least 10% on our thinking, and if it's only 10%,
also happening now.
yeah, if it's only 10%, we'll be quite happy. Yes. So I think for all of us in higher education, in our forward planning, we've had it might be an unpleasant elephant, but we've known about it for a while. And so we've certainly built those numbers into our forward planning, and the numbers still work for us. In our particular case, we benefited from an £8 million capital grant from the Higher Education Funding Council, which we think was probably about the last one of the ones they'll be able to give to help with the fit out of this, and that puts us in quite a good position. So I think that I'm reasonably confident about that. But I think the interesting thing, as all of us in higher education begin to adapt to this new world, will be whether or not partnership working becomes a smarter alternative than the acute competitiveness that we've been driven to by previous funding regimes, including the regime from HEFCE. Because that's often driven us, particularly in terms of attitude to research excellence, to actually carry out raids on each other's universities, which are very expensive, in order to meet competitive criteria. And I think we might see a phenomenon developing in the sector where it becomes much smarter for us to work together to get economies of scale to deal with that new environment. So I think that it'll force us to work in different ways.
Thank you very much. Did you have a question? Gentleman from there.
Oh, thank you. Peter Fale, University of Manchester. A very sharp comment and then a short question. The comment is in terms of the importance of this move for the Manchester brand with a small m, but a capital B, I suspect, and the way in which Manchester will be perceived across the world. And the reflection there is, in a sense, a hope in a way that the BBC and other organisations will have more programmes in terms of the knowledge wealth of the North and less on the knowledge wealth of the South, and rather more in terms of the deprivation in Peckham and rather less in terms of the deprivation in Moss Side. And these are small issues, but in terms of the international branding of a university such as Manchester are absolutely of critical importance. But the question really is in terms of the Manchester sporting brand. We had the pleasure at the university of having the outgoing president of the IOC in Manchester last week, who made some very, very positive noises about Manchester's global position as a city of sporting excellence. And clearly with our brands in terms of Manchester United, Manchester City, the 10K run, and so on and so forth. Having the armoury of BBC Sport in there as well strengthens no end that brand. And the question really is how can we ensure that we leverage each other brands in this global market?
Would you like to look at that, Richard?
I think this is the only time I've said it this morning. The honest answer is I don't know. But I know that BBC Sport would agree with everything you've just said. You didn't mention the Velodrome. That's another world-class institution. Dave Brailsford, what he's achieved there, I think, is phenomenal. And so BBC Sport is very, very keen to connect with those institutions and to establish themselves with the organisations you've mentioned, as you say, as a global centre of excellence here. It is an internationally recognised centre of excellence. So it touches upon many of the partnership themes I mentioned earlier about talent, for instance, the development of talent. But those are the conversations we need to have to bring those broad ideas to specific life, I think.
I think that there's a huge opportunity in, of course, the launch of the Manchester City region next year, which brings Greater Manchester together. And it's always challenging to talk about the Manchester brand on this side of the Irwell, of course. And one of the things that we do have to do is to achieve a branding, and I'm talking now much more locally, that gets away from this competitiveness between Salford and Manchester and enables us to actually see a situation where we do have a number of very good universities in Greater Manchester, and of course 4 of them, because Bolton is also going to be part of Greater Manchester as we move into that city region. That provides us with a huge branding opportunity, because I think I'm right in saying that if you take Greater Manchester as a whole, we've got something like 200,000 students in further and higher education, and I think that makes us one of the largest cities in Europe as a learning region, as a learning city. any city that's a learning city is going to have a huge branding opportunity. And of course, we all benefit from the sporting brands. You know, my previous job was for a long time at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, and whatever happened to Manchester United made the billboard headlines along Strand Street in Cape Town. So it's a world brand that I think you know, really benefits us all. And also, Salford City Reds is a great rugby league team.
Thank you. We've got time for probably one or two more, and then we're going to break for lunch. Gentleman at the back, and then the lady in front, please.
Hi, I'm Martin Isherwood. I'm Head of Music at Liverpool Institute for Performing Arts, and also a long-time community activist in Salford and involved in regeneration and so on. Very interested in music, obviously. I'm a musician, and interested in the opportunities that the relocation of the BBC over into Salford and moving BBC up to Salford gives for music. Music is one of those areas that local kids can get involved with very easily, and however the opportunities, particularly on the BBC, for broadcasting there for new music isn't there anymore. It used to be there. Just wondering what plans you may have for opening up music broadcasting for particularly music across the region, and can you bring Top of the Pops back as well?
Top of the Pops. I'm sorry, that's not within my gift, I'm afraid. I suspect the answer is no, but I'm happy to raise the question with the right person. Music, incredibly powerful. We have an orchestra here. It's a wonderful, wonderful asset. As you know, they have a very strong relationship with Salford City Council, where they're doing a huge amount of outreach, obviously in this region and more widely. We have set up 3 creative groups looking at what we can do to bring to this immediate site and the wider vicinity from probably late 2010. One of them is around music and performance. It's being led by Richard Wrigley, who you might know, runs the Philharmonic. If you don't know, I'd urge you to get in touch with him, because they are currently looking at what ideas can they develop to ensure a whole range of performances, outreach, connections with school children, other communities in this region from the end of next year. And one of the ideas, this may or may not happen, is could we commit, for instance, to 1 event and performance a day every single day of the year, starting on January the 1st, 2011. And many of those, of course, would be with the sorts of audiences you're talking about. So let's speak over lunch, and I'll put you in touch with Richard, because they're looking for ideas.
It's guitars, not violins, though, really.
I beg your pardon?
Guitars, not violins, is where it's coming
from. Okay.
Thank you. The lady in the front, please.
Hello, I'm Rachel McLean from the University of Bolton. I was just pleased to hear Martin mention Bolton there, rare mention for Bolton. I was just wondering if the panel have any advice for us, smaller universities such as Bolton, where we're doing lots of innovative things in terms of things like special effects for film and TV and animation, things like that spring to mind. I've invited a few people over to Bolton to come and see what we do, but nobody's taken me up on the offer yet. I just wondered if you have any advice for us on how we can raise the profile of Bolton, please, and other smaller universities.
Yeah. Well, thank you. In fact, I have been to your campus. In fact, and one of the first things that I did was to be taken around and look at it. And I think that, again, and it was the point of my answer about the Manchester City region, and I think that there are opportunities within the city region, but more locally in the northwest, for collaboration on precisely those sorts of points. Because when you take what our universities do and line up the things that we concentrate on, we have some things that we all do in common, but we have other things that are slightly different or completely different. So there's a huge scale benefit of us working together on these sorts of programs and taking them forward. I also think that, and it's something that I would like to talk to Bolton about more, there are great opportunities for us in loosening up the barriers between higher education and further education, because there are a lot of really interesting things happening in our further education colleges around these sorts of aspects of creativity. One of the things that does concern me, and it goes back to the previous question about engagement in community in greater cities like this, is how do we ensure that an opportunity such as this in Media City creates decent jobs in the communities around us? Because there is a bit of a gated community risk here, where you have a lot of high-value jobs just in Media City, but you don't, I mean, looking across there on the view, and that we're looking over there towards Seedley and Langworthy and areas like that, there is a risk that if the only jobs in those areas are low-end service jobs in security or catering or cleaning services, we're not actually spreading the value into all of our communities. Now, I think that there is an opportunity, particularly in working together and particularly linking up into further education, because, of course, we know when we take something like the challenge that was mentioned earlier of laying literally millions of metres of fibre, that's not going to be laid by graduate engineers. I mean, that's going to be laid by people working in teams with significant job opportunities for post-16-year-old school leavers who will create those sorts of chances. So I think if we get more of a collaborative approach and look at the compatibilities, we can see how we can connect up those engagements and create general economic benefit in the region that extends to the creation of significant job opportunities.
Thank you very much. And if I can just all ask you to show your appreciation for the speakers and indeed the panel. Thank you. Thank you very much.